Settle into the Sleepy Mind channel, and tonight we will explore the Great Smoky Mountains. If you enjoy these slow, immersive journeys, make sure to like and subscribe as new stories are shared each week. Along the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, a vast stretch of protected land covers more than 500,000 acres, forming the most visited national park in the United States. The Great Smoky Mountains rise here in long, rounded ridges, part of the ancient Appalachian Range, shaped over hundreds of millions of years and worn down into the softer forms seen today. The mountains do not rise sharply. Instead, they roll into one another in long, continuous layers, with peaks reaching above 6,600 feet, while valleys sit far below 1,000. This steady change in elevation creates a wide range of conditions across relatively short distances, allowing entirely different environments to exist side by side. A blue haze often hangs between these ridges, softening the distance and blending each layer into the next. It forms as moisture rises through the forest and mixes with natural compounds released by trees, scattering light in a way that makes the mountains appear to fade into one another. In the early hours, this haze settles low in the valleys before slowly lifting upward as the air begins to warm. Rain falls here more often than in most mountain regions in the eastern United States, feeding a network of streams that extends for thousands of miles through the park. The water moves steadily downhill, shaping valleys and carrying cold, clear flow across rock and soil. Even in quieter areas, the sound of moving water remains constant, a low and steady presence that carries through the forest. At lower elevations, hardwood forests dominate the landscape. Tall trees rise with broad canopies that filter the light, creating a soft, even glow beneath them. The ground is layered with fallen leaves that hold moisture close to the surface, forming a dense and quiet foundation where smaller plants begin to grow. The land rises, the air cools slightly, and the forest begins to change. The trees grow closer together, and the canopy becomes more compact, allowing less light to reach the ground. This shift is gradual, guided by elevation rather than any clear boundary, and it creates a steady transition between one environment and the next. Higher still, the forest changes again. Hardwood trees give way to darker stands of spruce and fir, where the air feels cooler and the ground is covered in a thick layer of needles. These high-elevation forests resemble those found much farther north, formed by the drop in temperature that comes with increasing height. Across all elevations, the park supports an extraordinary range of life. More than 19,000 species of plants and animals have already been identified, with many more still unknown. In some areas, the number of tree species alone exceeds what is found across entire continents, reflecting the unique conditions created by this landscape. Movement through the forest is quiet but constant. A black bear may travel across ridges and valleys, covering large distances as it searches for seasonal food. Beneath the surface, salamanders live within the damp leaf litter, so numerous that this region holds more species of them than anywhere else on Earth. Their presence depends entirely on the moisture held within the forest floor. Insects move through the air and soil in patterns that are easy to overlook. Some remain close to the ground, while others drift upward toward the canopy, forming part of a larger system that supports birds and other wildlife. These smaller forms of life are woven into the structure of the forest, sustaining it in ways that are not always visible. Water continues to shape everything here. Streams act as pathways through the mountains, guiding both movement and growth. Along their edges, vegetation becomes thicker, and the air feels cooler as moisture gathers and lingers. These areas form narrow corridors where life concentrates, creating dense pockets of activity within the broader forest. The air itself is always in motion, even when it feels still. It rises along the slopes as it warms, carrying moisture upward before cooling again at higher elevations. This cycle repeats throughout the day, maintaining the shifting haze that defines the mountains and giving the landscape its layered appearance. Long before this land became protected, people lived within these mountains for thousands of years. Indigenous communities moved through the region with a close understanding of its patterns, returning to the same valleys and ridges as seasons changed. Later, small farming communities settled in the lower areas, building homes where the land allowed it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, much of the forest was cleared as logging spread across the region. Hillsides that had stood untouched for centuries were cut down within a few decades, leaving the land exposed and altered. When the national park was established, that process was brought to an end, and the forest was given the chance to recover. Today, the landscape reflects both its long history and its ongoing renewal. Some areas still hold trees that are hundreds of years old, while others continue to regrow after earlier clearing. The forest does not return all at once, but in steady layers, shaped by time, water, and elevation. The day moves forward, light filters more evenly through the trees, and the haze lifts slightly along the higher ridges. The mountains extend outward in soft, repeating lines, each one fading into the next. The effect is continuous, without sharp edges or sudden changes, creating a sense of depth that feels both expansive and contained. Everything here moves within a steady rhythm. Water flows, air rises and cools, and life continues within the layers of the forest. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this balance quietly, shaped by forces that remain constant, even as the details shift from one moment to the next. The light settles more fully across the mountains. The shape of the land becomes easier to follow. Ridges extend in long, connected lines, rising and falling without sharp breaks, each one guiding the flow of water and air. From a distance, these ridges appear soft and rounded, but up close, their slopes are steep and deeply folded, shaped by processes that began hundreds of millions of years ago. The ground beneath the forest tells part of that story. Rocks emerge through the soil in uneven patterns, some smooth and worn, others fractured into rough edges. These stones are remnants of ancient formations, altered over time by pressure, heat, and constant exposure to the elements. Rainwater moves across them, slipping into small cracks and slowly widening them, continuing a process that never fully stops. As water seeps into the ground, it travels downward until it meets layers that slow its movement. From there, it begins to gather and emerge again, feeding the countless streams that run through the park. These streams follow the natural shape of the land, carving narrow channels that deepen gradually as they carry sediment away. Over long periods, this steady flow creates the valleys that define the Smoky Mountains. In some areas, the terrain opens into wider spaces where the slopes pull back just enough to form small, level ground. These valleys feel sheltered, with surrounding ridges rising on all sides. The soil here is deeper and more stable, allowing larger trees to take hold and grow without the same limitations found on steeper slopes. Water slows as it passes through these areas, spreading slightly before continuing downhill. The difference between ridge and valley creates subtle changes in temperature and moisture. Cold air tends to settle in lower areas, especially in the early morning, while higher slopes warm more quickly as they receive the first light of the day. This movement of air creates a pattern that repeats daily, shaping how plants and animals use the landscape. The sun continues to rise, the upper ridges begin to clear, while the valleys hold on to the last traces of fog. From above, the effect is layered, with bands of mist resting between ridgelines that remain fully visible. These patterns shift slowly, influenced by the warming air and the steady movement of moisture through the forest. The structure of the land also determines how the forest grows. On steep slopes, trees anchor themselves among rocks, their roots spreading outward in search of stability. The soil here is thinner, and water drains quickly, creating conditions that favor certain species over others. In contrast, the deeper soils of sheltered coves retain moisture for longer periods, supporting denser growth and a wider range of plant life. This variation in terrain contributes to the remarkable diversity found throughout the Smokies. Even short distances can bring noticeable changes in the forest, as elevation, slope direction, and water availability combine to shape each area. A ridge exposed to the sun will feel different from a shaded valley just below it, both in temperature and in the types of plants that grow there. Water continues to define these differences. Small tributaries join together to form larger streams, which in turn feed rivers that move out of the mountains and into surrounding regions. These waterways do more than carry water. They transport nutrients, shape habitats, and create pathways that wildlife follow through the forest. Along the edges of these streams, the ground often feels cooler and more stable. The constant presence of moisture allows plants to grow closer together, forming dense layers that provide shelter for smaller animals. Fallen branches and rocks interrupt the flow of water, creating small pools where insects gather and fish remain hidden beneath the surface. The movement of water also influences sound within the landscape. A quiet stream produces a soft, continuous murmur, while faster sections create sharper tones as water moves over stone. These sounds travel through the forest, blending with the occasional call of birds or the shifting of leaves overhead. The result is a steady background that changes slightly depending on location and time of day. The day continues. The temperature begins to rise more noticeably, especially at lower elevations. The higher ridges remain cooler, maintaining a contrast that affects how air moves across the mountains. Warm air rises along the slopes, while cooler air settles into valleys, creating a slow and continuous circulation that helps maintain the balance of moisture in the region. Clouds begin to form more clearly above the peaks, gathering as the rising air cools. In some cases, this leads to brief rainfall that moves across the mountains before clearing again. The forest absorbs this water quickly, with little disruption, as the ground is already adapted to frequent moisture. The shape of the Smokies, with their long ridges and deep valleys, allows these processes to repeat again and again. Water flows downward, air rises and cools, and the landscape continues to adjust in small ways. Nothing changes suddenly, but everything is in motion, guided by the structure of the land itself. In areas where the slopes are less steep, traces of past human presence can still be found. Old pathways follow the natural contours of the terrain, avoiding the steepest climbs and staying close to reliable sources of water. These routes reflect an understanding of the land, shaped by the need to move through it efficiently. The forest has grown back around these paths, softening their edges and blending them into the surrounding environment. What remains is subtle, often visible only when looked for closely. The land holds these traces without allowing them to dominate, returning to its own patterns over time. The afternoon light begins to shift. Shadows lengthen along the slopes, and the contrast between ridge and valley becomes more pronounced again. The higher elevations catch the last of the direct light, while lower areas begin to dim. The cycle that began in the early morning starts to move toward its quieter phase. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to reveal themselves through these patterns. The shape of the land guides everything that happens within it, from the movement of water to the growth of the forest. Each ridge and valley plays a role, creating a landscape that feels connected at every level. Moving through it is less about reaching a destination and more about following these gradual changes. The rise of the ground, the cooling of the air, and the steady presence of water all contribute to an experience that unfolds slowly, one step at a time. The mountains hold their form through all of this, shaped by forces that work quietly but persistently. Their rounded ridges and deep valleys are not static features, but part of an ongoing process that continues even now, carried forward by the same elements that have shaped them for millions of years. The forest changes with the season, though the shift is never sudden. It begins in small ways, often unnoticed at first, as temperature, moisture, and light adjust across the mountains. Each elevation responds differently, creating a gradual movement of change that travels up and down the ridges over the course of the year. In early spring, the lowest valleys begin to warm before the higher slopes. The ground, still damp from winter, softens as new growth pushes upward through the leaf litter. Small plants appear first, taking advantage of the open canopy before the trees fully leaf out. Their presence is brief but noticeable, forming a thin layer of color close to the ground before fading back into the forest as the season progresses. The weeks continue. This change moves upward. The same process repeats at slightly higher elevations, where cooler temperatures delay the growth just enough to create a sequence across the mountains. What begins in the valleys slowly climbs toward the ridges, creating a wave of seasonal change that can be followed by moving through the landscape. The trees respond more gradually. Buds begin to form along branches, swelling slowly before opening into leaves that spread outward and fill the canopy. Once this happens, the forest becomes more enclosed, with light filtered through layers of green. The air beneath the canopy feels cooler again, even as temperatures rise outside the forest. Water continues to move steadily through this transition. Spring rainfall adds to the flow of streams, increasing their speed and volume. What was once a quieter trickle becomes more active, with water pushing over rocks and carrying small debris downstream. The sound grows slightly louder, though it remains consistent, blending into the background of the forest. By early summer, the forest reaches a point of stability. The canopy is fully formed, and the ground below is shaded for most of the day. Moisture remains high, supported by frequent rainfall and the retention of water within the soil. The air feels thicker, holding both warmth and humidity, especially at lower elevations. At higher elevations, the conditions remain noticeably cooler. Even in summer, temperatures along the ridges rarely reach the same levels as the valleys below. This difference allows the spruce and fir forests to maintain their character, with darker, denser growth that holds onto moisture and resists the heat. Wildlife adjusts to these conditions as the season progresses. Animals follow patterns that match the availability of food and shelter. Black bears move through the forest in search of berries and other seasonal resources, covering large areas as they shift between elevations. Their movement is guided not by fixed routes, but by the changing distribution of food. In the forest floor, insects become more active, moving through the layers of soil and vegetation. Their presence supports a wide range of other life, creating a network of interactions that remains largely unseen. Birds move through the canopy, following these food sources, their calls occasionally breaking through the steady background of the forest. As summer reaches its peak, the forest feels dense and continuous. Growth has filled in most open spaces, and the structure of the landscape becomes less visible beneath the vegetation. Paths through the forest feel more enclosed, with branches and leaves forming a layered barrier on either side. Late in the season, the shift begins again. Temperatures start to ease, and the intensity of growth slows. Leaves change gradually, first in small patches, then more broadly across the forest. The timing of this change varies with elevation, beginning earlier on the higher ridges where cooler air arrives first. Color spreads across the mountains in a pattern that mirrors the earlier growth of spring. Reds, oranges, and yellows appear along the upper slopes before moving downward. The effect is not uniform. Instead, it creates a layered appearance, with different sections of the forest changing at different times. As leaves begin to fall, the canopy opens again. Light reaches the ground more directly, and the forest becomes brighter in a different way. The air feels drier, and the scent of leaves becomes more pronounced as they settle and begin to break down. Streams continue their steady movement, though their flow may reduce slightly as rainfall becomes less frequent. The sound remains present, but softer in some areas. The water still shapes the land, carrying sediment and maintaining the structure of valleys and channels. By late autumn, much of the forest floor is covered once again in a thick layer of fallen leaves. This layer serves as insulation, protecting the soil and the life within it as temperatures continue to drop. The forest begins to feel more open, with greater visibility between trees and across slopes. Winter arrives first at higher elevations. Frost forms along branches, and in some areas, snow begins to collect. The spruce and fir forests hold onto their needles, maintaining their shape even as surrounding trees stand bare. The air becomes colder and clearer, with less moisture suspended in it during certain periods. Lower elevations experience these changes more gradually. Snow may fall, but it often melts more quickly, returning to the soil and feeding the streams once again. The cycle of moisture continues, even as temperatures remain low. Wildlife adjusts once more. Some animals reduce their activity, while others continue to move through the forest, adapting to the colder conditions. The absence of leaves makes movement easier to see, though much of it still happens quietly and without disturbance. The mountains hold steady through all of this. The same ridges and valleys remain, while the details shift with each season. The changes are continuous but never abrupt, guided by elevation, moisture, and temperature in a pattern that repeats year after year. Moving through the Smokies during different seasons reveals these variations, but the underlying structure remains constant. The land does not change its form, only the way it is expressed through the forest, the air, and the water that moves across it. Each season builds on the last, creating a sequence that feels connected rather than separate. The forest grows, settles, and prepares again, maintaining a balance that continues without interruption. The Great Smoky Mountains exist within this steady cycle, shaped by conditions that return again and again, each time slightly different, yet always familiar within the rhythm of the land. The forest settles into its full form. The structure of it becomes easier to notice. It is not a single layer of trees, but a series of levels, each one shaped by light, space, and the slow competition for growth. From the ground to the highest branches, every part of the forest is occupied, creating a dense, continuous system that changes subtly with elevation and moisture. At the highest level, the canopy spreads across the mountains like a living roof. Tall hardwood trees reach upward, their branches extending outward to capture as much light as possible. In some areas, these trees rise more than 100 feet, forming a nearly unbroken layer that filters sunlight into softer tones below. The movement of leaves high above creates shifting patterns of light that move slowly across the forest floor. Beneath this canopy, a second layer forms where smaller trees grow in the spaces left by larger ones. These trees develop more slowly, adapting to reduced light as they wait for an opening above. When a large tree eventually falls, whether from age, wind, or saturated soil, the gap allows sunlight to reach the lower levels. In response, these younger trees accelerate their growth, filling the space over time and restoring the canopy. Closer to the ground, the understory becomes more noticeable. Shrubs and smaller plants spread outward, their leaves broader in shape to capture the limited light that filters through. In some areas, dense thickets form, creating shaded pockets where movement feels slower and more enclosed. These areas hold moisture longer, maintaining cooler conditions even as the surrounding forest warms during the day. At the forest floor, the structure changes again. Fallen leaves, branches, and decaying wood create a soft and uneven surface that supports a wide range of smaller life. This layer is not static. It shifts constantly as material breaks down and returns nutrients to the soil. The process is gradual but continuous, feeding the trees above and maintaining the balance of the forest. Tree diversity in the Smoky Mountains is unusually high, shaped by the range of conditions found across the park. In lower elevations, Species such as oak, hickory, and tulip poplar dominate, forming broad canopies that define the character of the forest. These trees grow tall and straight, competing for light while anchoring themselves in deeper soils that retain moisture. As elevation increases, the mix begins to change. Cooler air and thinner soils favor different species, and the forest gradually shifts in composition. Maples and birch appear more frequently, their leaves catching light differently and adding variation to the canopy. This transition does not happen all at once, but in small steps, guided by the conditions of each slope. Higher still, the forest changes more distinctly. Spruce and fir trees take hold, forming darker, denser stands that absorb more light than they reflect. Their needles create a softer ground layer, and their branches form tighter structures that hold snow and moisture more effectively. The air in these areas feels cooler, and the forest carries a different scent, sharper and more resin-like. Some areas within the park still hold trees that have stood for centuries. These older sections of forest are not always obvious at first glance, but they reveal themselves through subtle details. The trees are larger, with thicker trunks and more complex branching patterns. Fallen logs lie across the ground in various stages of decay, supporting moss, fungi, and new growth. In these older forests, the structure feels more layered and stable. Multiple generations of trees exist together, each at a different stage of growth. The canopy is uneven, allowing light to pass through in irregular patterns. This creates a more varied environment below, where different plants can take hold depending on the conditions available to them. Other areas of the park are younger, shaped by the period of heavy logging that once affected much of the region. Here, the trees are more uniform in size, having grown back at similar times. The canopy may feel more consistent, with fewer gaps and less variation in structure. Over time, these forests continue to develop, gradually moving toward the complexity seen in older growth. The interaction between roots and soil plays a critical role in this process. Tree roots extend outward as well as downward, forming networks that stabilize the ground and absorb water. In steeper areas, these roots help hold the soil in place, reducing erosion and allowing vegetation to remain anchored despite heavy rainfall. Below the surface, these root systems often overlap, creating connections between trees. Nutrients and moisture move through the soil, supporting growth across the forest rather than within isolated areas. The result is a system that functions collectively, with each tree contributing to the stability of the whole. Light continues to shape everything above ground. Areas that receive more direct sunlight support faster growth, while shaded regions develop more slowly. This variation creates differences in density, with some sections of forest feeling open and others more enclosed. These changes occur gradually, guided by the position of the sun and the structure of the canopy. Wind moves through the upper layers more easily than it does near the ground. High branches sway and shift, while the lower forest remains relatively still. This movement helps distribute seeds and affects how trees grow over time, influencing their shape and direction. The day progresses, the forest maintains a steady rhythm. Light shifts, air moves, and the balance between growth and decay continues without interruption. Each layer supports the next, forming a system that feels complete. with no single part standing apart from the rest. Moving through this environment reveals how interconnected these layers are. A change in light above affects growth below. A fallen tree alters the structure of the canopy and creates space for new life. Moisture held in the soil supports everything from the smallest plants to the tallest trees. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this complexity quietly, without drawing attention to any single feature. The forest does not present itself all at once. Instead, it unfolds gradually, revealing its structure through observation and movement, shaped by conditions that continue to shift with elevation, moisture, and time. This layered system defines the character of the Smokies. It is not only the presence of trees, but the way they grow together, forming a continuous living structure that extends from the ground to the highest branches, sustained by processes that remain steady and ongoing. Movement through the Great Smoky Mountains is rarely obvious at first. The forest appears still, with its dense canopy holding steady overhead, and the ground resting beneath layers of leaves and roots. Yet this landscape supports one of the most biologically rich environments in North America, with more than 19,000 documented species and tens of thousands more believed to exist within its boundaries. This diversity is not spread evenly across the land. It is shaped by elevation, moisture, and temperature, creating distinct layers of life that shift as the terrain rises from just under 900 feet to more than 6,600 feet. Each change in height brings a change in conditions, and with it, a different combination of plants and animals. Black bears move through this system with quiet efficiency, covering wide areas of the park as they search for seasonal food. The Smoky Mountains hold one of the densest populations of black bears in the eastern United States, supported by the availability of berries, nuts, and plant growth that changes throughout the year. Their movement follows no fixed trail, but instead adapts constantly to what the forest provides. White-tailed deer move more visibly through open areas and along the edges of forest clearings, feeding on grasses and low vegetation. Their presence is more easily observed, especially in the early morning and late afternoon when temperatures are cooler. They follow established paths through the terrain, shaped by the structure of the land and the need for reliable access to food and water. Beneath this larger movement, a more concentrated form of life exists within the forest floor. The Smoky Mountains are known as the salamander capital of the world, containing more species of salamanders than any other place on Earth. Many of these species spend their entire lives within the damp layers of soil and leaf litter, relying on the constant moisture that the forest provides. This moisture is sustained by the high levels of rainfall across the park, which in some areas exceed 80 inches each year. The dense canopy slows evaporation, allowing the ground to remain cool and stable for long periods. These conditions create an environment where amphibians can thrive without the need for standing water, moving instead through the hidden spaces beneath the surface. Insects form another essential part of this system, though they are often overlooked. Thousands of species move through the air, across the ground, and within the soil, forming a foundation that supports much of the larger life within the forest. Many remain unnamed, reflecting the complexity of the environment and the ongoing work to fully understand it. At certain times of year, this activity becomes briefly visible in a way that is rarely seen elsewhere. Synchronous fireflies gather in specific areas of the Smokies, flashing in coordinated patterns that depend on exact conditions of temperature, moisture, and timing. This phenomenon occurs in only a few places in the world and draws attention to the precision with which life in these mountains responds to its environment. Bird life adds another layer to this movement. More than 200 species have been recorded within the park, ranging from those that remain year-round to others that pass through during seasonal migrations. Their presence is often marked by sound, with calls that carry through the forest at varying distances, depending on the structure of the canopy and the movement of air. Streams and waterways support additional forms of life, creating cooler environments where fish and aquatic insects remain active. Native brook trout hold their position in cold, clear water, often in streams that have remained stable for long periods. These waterways act as connections between different parts of the ecosystem, allowing movement to occur along their edges. The structure of the forest influences how all of this life moves. Dense canopy limits visibility and shapes the paths available to animals, while the uneven ground of roots and fallen wood creates natural barriers and corridors. Movement becomes a matter of adaptation, guided by the terrain rather than imposed upon it. Elevation continues to define these patterns. Lower areas support species that prefer warmer conditions and thicker vegetation, while higher elevations, with their cooler air and different forest types, support species adapted to those environments. This layering allows the Smoky Mountains to hold an unusual concentration of biodiversity within a relatively compact area. Predation and survival operate within this system without drawing attention to themselves. Larger animals move in search of food, while smaller species rely on cover and timing to avoid detection. These interactions are constant, though rarely visible, forming a balance that remains stable over time. Even in moments where the forest appears quiet, this activity continues. A slight shift in leaves may mark the passage of an animal. A brief movement in the canopy may indicate a bird changing position. The surface of a stream may ripple as something moves beneath it. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this continuous movement within a landscape that appears calm. The density of life does not reveal itself all at once. It becomes apparent through attention, through the recognition that what seems still is in constant motion. This movement is shaped by the conditions of the land itself: moisture, elevation, and temperature guide where species live and how they move, creating a system that remains connected across the entire range of the mountains. Within this system, no single element stands alone. Each form of life depends on another, whether through food, shelter, or the conditions that allow it to exist. The result is a network that extends from the highest canopy to the soil beneath, supported by processes that continue without interruption. Water in the Great Smoky Mountains does not begin where it is most visible. It starts quietly, held within the ground, gathered in the thick layer of soil and organic material that covers the forest floor. After rainfall, much of this water does not run across the surface. Instead, it is absorbed, moving slowly downward through layers of earth and rock before emerging again in small, steady sources. These sources appear along slopes as springs, often unnoticed at first. Water seeps outward from the ground, collecting just enough to begin forming narrow channels. As more moisture joins, these channels connect, creating the beginnings of streams that extend throughout the mountains. Across the park, more than 2,000 miles of streams flow through this system, forming one of the most extensive networks in any national park. The clarity of this water is shaped by the forest itself. The dense canopy reduces direct sunlight, helping to keep temperatures low, while the soil acts as a natural filter, removing sediment as water moves through it. As a result, many streams in the Smokies remain cold and exceptionally clear, even as they travel through dense vegetation and uneven terrain. Within these streams, native brook trout hold their position against the current. These fish require cold, clean water to survive, making them a direct reflection of the conditions within the park. Their presence indicates a system that remains stable, supported by consistent moisture and minimal disturbance. As streams move downhill, their behavior changes with the terrain. In steeper sections, water flows quickly, moving over exposed rock and creating a continuous, sharper sound. In areas where the slope eases, the flow slows, forming pools where sediment can settle and the surface becomes more reflective. These variations occur repeatedly, shaped by the structure of the land. Streams rarely exist in isolation. Smaller channels feed into larger ones, increasing both the volume and force of the water as it continues downward. Over time, this process has carved the valleys that define the Smoky Mountains, shaping the land through steady erosion rather than sudden change. Along the edges of these waterways, conditions differ from the surrounding forest. The ground remains cooler and more consistently damp, supporting dense plant growth that thrives in high moisture environments. Roots extend toward the water, stabilizing the soil and reducing erosion, while fallen branches and rocks create small interruptions in the flow. These riparian areas serve as natural pathways through the forest. Animals move along streams where vegetation is often more open and water is readily available. Tracks may appear briefly in softer ground, though they are often erased by the next rainfall or shift in water level. The role of water in the Smokies extends beyond the boundaries of the park. Streams that begin within these mountains contribute to larger river systems, including the Tennessee River watershed. The water that flows out of the Smokies carries with it the influence of the forest, remaining clean and filtered as it moves into surrounding regions. Rainfall plays a central role in maintaining this system. The Smoky Mountains receive an average of 55 to 85 inches of precipitation each year, with higher elevations often receiving even more. This consistent input of moisture allows streams to flow year-round, even during periods when rainfall is less frequent. When heavier rain does occur, the volume of water increases quickly. Streams rise, and their movement becomes more forceful as they carry additional sediment downstream. Even in these moments, the forest helps regulate the flow, slowing runoff and allowing water to spread and absorb rather than rush through the landscape unchecked. At higher elevations, water behaves differently. Cooler temperatures reduce evaporation, allowing moisture to remain within the soil and vegetation for longer periods. In these areas, water may remain suspended in the air as mist or cloud, contributing to the characteristic haze that gives the Smoky Mountains their name. This constant presence of moisture creates a cycle that continues without interruption. Water rises into the air, condenses, falls again, and moves through the forest before returning to the atmosphere. Each stage of this process is shaped by the terrain, with ridges guiding airflow and valleys collecting moisture. The sound of water is one of the most consistent elements within the park. It shifts depending on location, from the quiet movement of smaller streams to the more pronounced flow of larger channels. This sound travels through the forest, blending with other natural elements and forming a steady background that changes subtly throughout the day. Light interacts with water in ways that shift constantly. In shaded areas, the surface appears darker, defined more by movement than reflection. In areas where light reaches the water directly, brief patterns of brightness appear, moving with the current and changing as the angle of light shifts. The structure of the Smokies ensures that water is always in motion. There is no point where it remains still for long. Even in calm pools, small movements continue beneath the surface, guided by the steady flow from higher elevations. Over long periods, this movement has shaped the mountains in ways that are both visible and subtle. Valleys have deepened, channels have shifted, and the distribution of soil has been influenced by the continuous passage of water. These changes occur gradually, often unnoticed within a single lifetime. The Great Smoky Mountains depend on this system for their stability. Water supports plant life, shapes the terrain, and provides the conditions necessary for the wide range of species that exist within the park. It connects different parts of the landscape, allowing energy and nutrients to move through the system. Within this network, every stream, spring, and channel plays a role. None exist separately. Each one contributes to a larger pattern of movement that defines how the mountains function as a whole. The presence of water is constant, whether visible in flowing streams or held quietly within the ground. It continues to move through the Smokies, guided by gravity, shaped by the land, and sustained by the conditions that make these mountains one of the most moisture-rich environments in the region. As air continues to move across the Great Smoky Mountains, it carries moisture with it, shaping the weather in ways that are closely tied to the form of the land. The mountains rise high enough to interrupt the movement of air masses, forcing them upward as they pass over the ridges. As this air rises, it cools, and the moisture within it begins to condense, forming clouds that often settle directly along the slopes. This process happens regularly across the Smokies and is one of the main reasons the region receives such high levels of rainfall. Moist air, moving inland from the Gulf of Mexico, is lifted by the mountains, releasing precipitation as it cools. This contributes to the average of 55 to 85 inches of rain each year, with some of the highest peaks receiving even more. The constant presence of moisture in the air gives the mountains their name. A natural haze forms as fine particles and water vapor scatter light, creating the soft blue-gray appearance that lingers across the ridges. This haze is not the result of smoke, but of the forest itself, where vegetation releases compounds into the air that interact with moisture and sunlight. Fog forms easily under these conditions, especially in the early morning and late evening. Cooler air settles into the valleys, allowing moisture to condense near the ground. The fog does not remain fixed. It moves slowly, drifting upward along the slopes or thinning as temperatures rise. In some areas, it may remain for much of the day, while in others it lifts quickly, revealing the layers of the mountains beyond. Temperature varies significantly with elevation, For every 1,000 feet gained in height, the air becomes noticeably cooler. This creates multiple climate zones within the park, even though the distances between them are relatively small. Lower elevations may feel warm and humid, while higher ridges remain cool and damp at the same time. During the warmer months, this variation can lead to sudden changes in weather. Clouds may build quickly over the ridges, developing into brief but intense rain showers. These storms often pass through without lasting long, leaving behind cooler air and renewed moisture within the forest. In winter, the higher elevations experience conditions that differ sharply from the valleys below. Snow and ice are more common along the upper ridges, where temperatures remain lower for longer periods. These conditions can persist even when lower areas receive only rain, creating a contrast that reflects the influence of elevation across the mountains. Wind also behaves differently depending on location. Along exposed ridges, it moves more freely, carrying moisture and influencing how trees grow over time. Branches may lean slightly in response to consistent wind patterns, shaping the appearance of the forest in subtle ways. In contrast, valleys and sheltered areas experience less wind, allowing moisture to remain more stable. Cloud cover shifts throughout the day, sometimes forming a continuous layer that softens the light across the landscape. At other times, clouds break apart, allowing sunlight to pass through in varying intensity. These changes affect how the forest appears, altering contrast, color, and visibility across short periods. The day progresses, rising temperatures cause fog to lift and moisture to move upward into the atmosphere. This does not remove it from the system, but redistributes it, allowing it to return later as cloud or rain. The cycle continues without interruption, guided by the interaction between air, water, and land. The terrain of the Smokies plays a constant role in shaping these patterns. Ridges direct the movement of air, while valleys collect cooler, denser layers. This creates localized weather conditions that can differ noticeably within short distances, adding to the complexity of the environment. Even on days without rainfall, moisture remains present in the air. The forest holds onto it, releasing it slowly as temperatures change. This contributes to the steady humidity that defines the region, supporting the dense vegetation and the wide range of species that depend on it. The Great Smoky Mountains exist within this continuous exchange between air and moisture. Weather does not pass over the landscape without interaction. It is shaped by the land itself, responding to elevation, slope, and the presence of the forest. These patterns repeat daily and seasonally, forming a system that remains active at all times. Clouds form, move, and dissolve. Rain falls and returns to the air. Fog gathers and lifts. Each part of this process connects to the others, maintaining the balance that defines the Smokies. The presence of people within the Great Smoky Mountains stretches back far beyond the creation of the national park, woven into the same landscape that supports the forest, water, and wildlife. Long before roads or boundaries were established, indigenous communities moved through these mountains with a deep understanding of their terrain, using the land in ways that followed its natural patterns rather than altering them. The Cherokee lived throughout this region, traveling along routes that followed ridges and valleys where movement was more manageable. These paths were shaped by the structure of the land itself, avoiding steep slopes and staying close to water sources that remained reliable throughout the year. The mountains provided food, shelter, and materials, supporting a way of life that was closely tied to seasonal change. Plant knowledge was central to this relationship. Forests provided not only food, but also medicinal resources, with specific plants gathered at certain times and locations. This use of the land required careful observation, understanding how elevation, moisture, and sunlight affected where different species would grow. Movement through the mountains was guided by this knowledge, creating a connection that extended beyond simple travel. As European settlers began to enter the region in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the use of the land began to shift. Small communities formed in valleys where the terrain allowed for limited farming. These settlements were often isolated, separated by ridges that made travel difficult, leading to a way of life shaped by both the resources available and the challenges of the landscape. Cabins were built using timber from the surrounding forest, with stone used for foundations and chimneys. Fields were cleared in small sections, following the contours of the land rather than reshaping it entirely. Livestock moved within these spaces, and crops were planted in soil that varied in depth and quality depending on location. Daily life remained closely tied to the environment. Water was drawn from nearby streams, and travel between communities followed the same natural routes established earlier. The mountains limited expansion, keeping settlements relatively small and contained within areas where conditions allowed. By the late 19th century, a more significant change began to take place. Logging operations expanded into the Smokies, driven by increasing demand for timber. Railroads were constructed to reach deeper into the mountains, allowing large sections of forest to be removed at a pace that had not been possible before. This activity altered the landscape in noticeable ways. Hillsides that had been covered in mature forest were cleared, exposing soil to rainfall and increasing erosion. Streams carried more sediment, and the balance that had developed over long periods began to shift within a much shorter time. The scale of logging raised concerns about the long-term condition of the mountains. Efforts to protect the remaining forest began to grow, supported by individuals and groups who recognized the importance of preserving the landscape. These efforts led to the eventual establishment of the national park in 1934, bringing together land from both Tennessee and North Carolina. The creation of the park required the purchase of private land, including farms and communities that had existed within the mountains for generations. Families were relocated, and structures were left behind or removed, allowing the forest to begin its process of recovery. This transition marked a significant shift in how the land would be used moving forward. Over time, areas that had been cleared began to regrow. Trees returned, filling in open spaces and gradually restoring the forest. This process continues today, with younger growth blending into older sections that were never logged, creating variation across the landscape. Remnants of earlier settlements still remain, though they are often subtle. Cabins, barns, and stone walls can be found within the forest, standing as quiet markers of a different period. These structures are preserved as part of the park, offering a glimpse into how people once lived within the mountains. The network of trails that exist today often follows the same routes used in the past. Many of these paths trace old roads or footways that connected communities, now adapted for movement through the park without altering the surrounding environment. They continue to follow the natural contours of the land, reflecting the same logic that guided their original use. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park has become the most visited national park in the United States, with millions of people entering each year. Despite this level of visitation, the structure of the landscape remains largely intact, supported by efforts to limit impact and preserve the conditions that define the region. Management within the park focuses on maintaining this balance. Roads and facilities are limited in scope, and large sections of the forest remain undisturbed. The goal is not to reshape the land, but to allow it to continue its natural processes while providing access in a controlled way. Visitors move through the park in patterns that follow established routes, whether along trails, roads, or designated areas. This movement is guided to reduce disruption, allowing the forest, water systems, and wildlife to function without significant interference. The presence of people today differs from that of the past. Where the land was once used for farming and resource extraction, it is now protected and observed. This shift reflects a broader understanding of the importance of preserving the Smokies as a complex and interconnected system. The mountains hold these layers of history within their current form. The land, shaped over millions of years, carries the marks of human activity while continuing to function according to its natural patterns. Forests regrow, water flows, and wildlife moves through the same terrain that has supported life for generations. This connection between past and present remains visible in the details. A trail that follows an old road, a structure that stands within the trees, or a clearing that has returned to forest, all reflect the changes that have taken place. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to exist as a landscape where human history and natural systems meet, each influencing the other without fully replacing what came before. The result is a place that holds both memory and ongoing change within the same environment. The forest continues to hold the marks of both natural processes and human history. Its role within a larger system becomes more apparent. The Great Smoky Mountains do not exist in isolation. They are part of a broader ecological network that extends beyond the park boundaries, influencing and supporting regions far beyond the ridges themselves. Water flowing from the Smokies feeds into major river systems, including the Tennessee River watershed. This connection carries clean, filtered water out of the mountains and into surrounding communities, supporting agriculture, ecosystems, and human use across multiple states. The quality of this water reflects the condition of the forest, shaped by soil, vegetation, and the absence of large-scale disturbance. The forest acts as a natural filtration system. Rainfall is absorbed into the ground, slowed by layers of organic material and root networks that hold soil in place. As water moves through this system, sediment is reduced, and nutrients are distributed in controlled ways. This process maintains the clarity of streams and contributes to the stability of waterways beyond the park. Air movement also connects the Smokies to the larger region. Moist air entering the mountains is lifted and cooled, releasing precipitation that sustains the forest. At the same time, compounds released by vegetation interact with sunlight and moisture, contributing to the characteristic haze that extends across the ridges. This haze is part of a broader atmospheric system, linking the forest to the air that moves across the eastern United States. The mountains themselves are part of the Appalachian Range, one of the oldest mountain systems in the world. Their age, estimated at over 300 million years, reflects a long period of geological change that has shaped their current form. Unlike younger mountain ranges with sharp peaks and exposed rock, the Smokies have been worn down over time, creating the rounded ridges and deep valleys that define the landscape. This long history has allowed ecosystems to develop and persist through changing conditions. During past ice ages, glaciers did not reach the Smoky Mountains, allowing plant and animal species to remain and adapt rather than being forced out. This stability contributed to the high level of biodiversity found in the region today, as species had time to evolve and spread across different elevations. The park's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and an International Biosphere Reserve reflects its global importance. These recognitions highlight not only the diversity of life within the Smokies, but also the role the region plays in understanding ecological processes and conservation. The forest continues to act as a living system that supports research and observation. Scientists study its plant life, animal populations, and environmental conditions to better understand how ecosystems function over time. The large number of species, many of which are still being discovered, provides ongoing opportunities for study. Connectivity within the park is also shaped by its extensive network of trails, which cover more than 800 miles. These trails allow movement across the mountains while following the natural contours of the land. They connect valleys, ridges, and high elevation areas, reflecting both historical pathways and modern access routes. Despite this access, large portions of the park remain relatively undisturbed. The size of the protected area allows natural processes to continue with minimal interference, maintaining conditions that support long-term ecological stability. This balance between access and preservation is central to how the Smokies function today. Wildlife moves across these connected systems without regard for park boundaries. Animals follow food sources, seasonal changes, and environmental conditions, often traveling between protected and surrounding areas. This movement reinforces the idea that the Smokies are part of a larger ecological landscape rather than a separate unit. Plant life reflects this connectivity as well. Seeds are carried by wind, water, and animals, allowing vegetation to spread and adapt across different areas. The variation in elevation creates multiple habitats within a relatively small geographic space, supporting a wide range of species within the same region. The interaction between these elements forms a system that extends beyond what can be seen within a single location. Water flows outward, air moves across the mountains, and species travel between environments, linking the Smokies to a broader network of natural processes. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to function as both a distinct landscape and a connected part of a larger system. Their influence reaches beyond their visible boundaries, shaped by the movement of water, air, and life across the region. As elevation continues to rise through the Great Smoky Mountains, the forest begins to shift in ways that are both gradual and unmistakable. The change is not marked by a clear boundary, but by a steady transition in temperature, moisture, and the types of trees that can survive under these conditions. Moving upward, the air becomes cooler, and the structure of the forest adjusts to match this shift, At higher elevations, the hardwood forests that dominate the lower slopes begin to thin, giving way to a different kind of environment. Red spruce and Fraser fir take hold, forming what is often called a boreal forest, more commonly found in regions much farther north. These trees grow densely, their branches angled downward and close together, creating a canopy that allows very little light to reach the ground. This type of forest exists in the Smokies because of the elevation range within the park, which rises from under 900 feet to over 6,600 feet. At these higher levels, conditions resemble those found in Canada, with cooler temperatures and increased moisture, creating an environment where spruce and fir can survive. The ground beneath these trees reflects the difference immediately. Instead of broad leaves, the forest floor is covered with needles that form a softer, more even layer. This surface holds moisture efficiently, maintaining damp conditions that persist even during periods without rainfall. Moss grows across rocks and fallen wood, adding another layer that retains water and supports smaller forms of life. Light behaves differently in these forests. The dense canopy absorbs much of it, creating a darker environment even during the middle of the day. Visibility is reduced compared to lower elevations, and the forest feels more enclosed. This limited light affects the types of plants that can grow beneath the canopy, reducing diversity in some areas while allowing specialized species to thrive. Temperature remains consistently cooler at these elevations. For roughly every 1,000 feet gained in elevation, temperatures drop several degrees, creating a noticeable contrast between valleys and ridges. Even in summer, the difference between high and low areas can be significant, often enough to influence how long moisture remains on the ground and how quickly vegetation grows. Despite this slower growth, some trees within these high-elevation forests have stood for hundreds of years. Their trunks are often narrower, and their growth rings reflect the gradual pace at which they developed. The forest here is shaped more by persistence than by rapid expansion, with each tree adapting to conditions that limit speed but support long-term survival. Wind plays a more noticeable role at higher elevations. Without the protection of surrounding terrain, exposed ridges allow air to move more freely through the trees. This constant movement influences how trees grow, sometimes causing branches to lean or limiting their height. In extreme conditions, wind can shape entire sections of forest, creating areas where trees grow shorter and more tightly clustered. Moisture remains a defining feature of these upper slopes. Clouds often form at these elevations, sometimes settling directly within the forest. Visibility can change quickly as mist moves through the trees, creating an environment where the boundary between air and land becomes less distinct. This frequent cloud cover contributes to the consistent dampness that supports the ecosystem. These high-elevation forests also play a role in capturing moisture from the air itself. As clouds move through the trees, water condenses on needles and branches, dripping down to the ground even without rainfall. This process adds to the total moisture available within the system, reinforcing the conditions that allow these forests to exist. Wildlife adapts to these conditions in ways that reflect the limited resources available. Certain bird species remain closely tied to spruce and fir habitats, relying on the structure of these trees for nesting and feeding. Insects that inhabit these forests are also specialized, adapted to cooler temperatures, and the specific vegetation found at higher elevations. The Fraser fir, one of the defining trees of these upper slopes, faces ongoing challenges from invasive pests, such as the balsam woolly adelgid. This insect has caused widespread damage to fir populations, altering sections of the forest and changing how these areas function. Restoration efforts continue, but the impact remains visible in parts of the park. Air quality also affects these high-elevation ecosystems more strongly than lower areas. Pollutants carried through the atmosphere can accumulate along ridges, influencing soil chemistry and plant health. These effects are subtle but significant, shaping how the forest develops over time. Water behaves differently at these heights. Cooler temperatures reduce evaporation, allowing moisture to remain within the soil and vegetation for longer periods. Small streams form here as well, though they often begin as narrow flows that gather strength as they move downhill. These upper sources contribute to the larger network of streams that define the Smokies. The presence of water in both liquid and airborne forms creates a constant cycle. Moisture rises, condenses, and returns to the ground, supporting the forest and maintaining the conditions required for these species to survive. This cycle is more pronounced at higher elevations, where temperature differences encourage condensation and cloud formation. The contrast between high and low elevations is one of the defining features of the Smokies. Within a relatively short distance, the landscape shifts from warm, dense hardwood forests to cooler, darker spruce fir environments. This variation contributes directly to the park's biodiversity, allowing species from different climate zones to exist within the same region. As light moves across these upper ridges, the forest remains subdued in tone. The canopy absorbs much of the brightness, and shadows persist even during the brightest parts of the day. This creates a consistent atmosphere that differs from the more varied light found at lower elevations. Movement through this environment feels more contained. The density of the trees and the limited visibility create a sense of enclosure, where distance is harder to judge and sound becomes a more important guide. Wind, moisture, and subtle movement within the forest define the space more than visual detail. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this variation in elevation as a continuous system. Each level connects to the next, forming a sequence that moves from valley to ridge without interruption. The high elevation forests are not separate from the rest of the park, but part of a larger structure shaped by the rise and fall of the land. Within this structure, conditions continue to shift gradually. Temperature, moisture, and light adjust with elevation, guiding the distribution of life across the mountains. The result is a landscape where change is constant but never abrupt, unfolding through layers that remain connected across the entire range. The higher elevations settle into their cooler, denser conditions. The movement of time across the Great Smoky Mountains becomes most visible through the changing seasons. These changes do not arrive all at once. Instead, they move through the landscape in layers, shaped by elevation, temperature, and the steady presence of moisture. Spring begins first in the lower valleys, where temperatures rise earlier and the ground warms more quickly. New growth appears along the forest floor, taking advantage of the brief window before the canopy fully forms. Wildflowers emerge in large numbers, creating one of the most diverse spring displays in North America. Over 1,500 species of flowering plants exist within the park, many of them appearing during this early period when sunlight can still reach the ground. The season progresses, this wave of growth moves upward. What begins in the valleys gradually climbs toward the ridges, following the change in temperature across elevation. This pattern, sometimes called spring progression, allows the same species to bloom at different times depending on height, extending the season across the mountains rather than limiting it to a single moment. Trees respond more slowly. Buds form along branches before opening into leaves that spread across the canopy. As this canopy fills in, light reaching the forest floor becomes more limited, and the early growth below begins to fade. The forest transitions from open and bright to enclosed and shaded, marking the shift into late spring. Summer brings a period of stability, though conditions vary depending on elevation. Lower areas become warm and humid, while higher ridges remain noticeably cooler. The difference between these zones can be several degrees, creating multiple climate experiences within the same park. Rainfall remains frequent during this time, often arriving in the form of short but intense storms. Warm air rising from the valleys meets cooler air above, leading to cloud formation and sudden rain showers. These storms contribute to the steady supply of water that supports the dense vegetation throughout the Smokies. The forest reaches its fullest density in summer. Leaves cover nearly every available space within the canopy, and the ground below remains shaded for most of the day. Moisture is held within the system, supported by both rainfall and reduced evaporation beneath the trees. Wildlife follows these seasonal patterns closely. Food sources become more abundant, and movement increases as animals take advantage of the conditions. Black bears, for example, expand their range during this time, feeding on berries and other plant growth that becomes available across different elevations. As summer begins to fade, the first signs of change appear at higher elevations. Cooler temperatures arrive earlier along the ridges, triggering shifts in the leaves of certain tree species. This change does not occur uniformly. Instead, it spreads gradually, beginning in the uppermost areas and moving downward over time. Autumn brings a transformation that is both visual and structural. Leaves change color as chlorophyll breaks down, revealing underlying pigments that create reds, oranges, and yellows across the forest. The timing of this process varies with elevation, creating a layered effect where different sections of the mountains change at different times. This progression can last for several weeks, as each elevation moves through its own cycle. The result is a constantly shifting landscape, where color spreads across the mountains in waves rather than appearing all at once. As leaves begin to fall, the canopy opens again. Light reaches the forest floor more directly, and the structure of the land becomes more visible. The ground is covered with a new layer of leaves, adding to the organic material that will eventually break down and return nutrients to the soil. Temperature continues to drop as autumn progresses. Nights become cooler, and the air holds less moisture. This shift prepares the forest for winter, reducing growth and slowing many of the processes that dominate the warmer months. Winter arrives first at higher elevations, where temperatures fall below freezing more consistently. Snow and ice become more common along the ridges, while lower areas may experience a mix of conditions. The difference in elevation once again creates variation, with some parts of the park fully covered, while others remain only lightly affected. The forest changes in response. Deciduous trees stand without leaves, revealing the full structure of their branches. Evergreen species maintain their form, providing contrast within the landscape. Visibility increases across the forest, allowing longer views between trees and across slopes. Wildlife adjusts to these conditions in different ways. Some animals reduce their activity, while others remain active throughout the season, relying on stored food or adapted behaviors to survive. Movement continues, though often at a slower pace, shaped by the colder environment. Water continues to move through the system even in winter. Streams remain active, though their flow may be reduced in some areas. Ice forms along edges and in slower sections, but the underlying movement of water does not stop. The seasonal cycle within the Smokies is not defined by sharp transitions, but by gradual shifts that move across the landscape. Each season overlaps with the next, creating a continuous progression rather than a series of separate stages. Elevation remains the guiding factor in how these changes unfold. From valley to ridge, the same processes occur at different times, extending each season across the mountains and adding depth to the overall experience of the landscape. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this cycle in constant motion, with each season shaping the forest, water, and wildlife in ways that reflect the conditions of the land. The seasonal cycle continues across the Great Smoky Mountains. The structure beneath the forest becomes just as important as what grows above it. The soil, rock, and underlying geology shape how water moves, how plants take root, and how the entire system remains stable over time. The mountains themselves are among the oldest on Earth, formed more than 300 million years ago during the collision of ancient landmasses. Over time, erosion has worn down what were once much higher peaks, leaving behind the rounded ridges and deep valleys that define the Smokies today. This long process has shaped not only the visible landscape, but also the composition of the ground beneath it. The soil in the Smoky Mountains is not uniform. It varies depending on elevation, slope, and the type of rock beneath it. In many areas, it is relatively thin, especially along steeper ridges where erosion has removed much of the surface material. In valleys and lower slopes, soil tends to be deeper, allowing for more extensive root systems and larger plant growth. This soil is built from layers of organic material that have accumulated over time. Leaves, branches, and fallen trees break down slowly, returning nutrients to the ground. This process is supported by moisture, which remains present throughout much of the year due to the high levels of rainfall in the region. Fungi play a central role in this system. Their networks extend through the soil, connecting with the roots of trees and helping to transfer nutrients between them. These connections allow the forest to function as a coordinated system rather than a collection of individual plants. Nutrients are shared, and resources are distributed in ways that support overall stability. The rock beneath the soil also influences how the forest develops. Much of the Smoky Mountains is composed of sedimentary and metamorphic rock, which affects how water moves through the ground. In some areas, water passes easily through cracks and spaces in the rock, while in others, it is held closer to the surface. This variation creates differences in moisture levels across the landscape. Some areas remain consistently damp, supporting dense vegetation and a wide range of species. Others are slightly drier, leading to different patterns of plant growth. These changes are often subtle, but they contribute to the overall diversity of the forest. Roots anchor trees within this system, extending both downward and outward through the soil. On steeper slopes, these roots help hold the ground in place, reducing erosion and preventing soil from being washed away during heavy rainfall. This stabilizing effect is essential in maintaining the structure of the mountains. When trees fall, whether from age, wind, or saturated soil, they create openings in the canopy that allow light to reach the forest floor. These gaps are an important part of the forest's natural cycle. New growth begins in these spaces, and the fallen tree itself becomes part of the soil as it breaks down over time. This process adds to the depth of the organic layer, increasing the soil's ability to hold moisture and support future growth. The cycle of growth, decay, and renewal continues without interruption, guided by the conditions present within the forest. Water interacts closely with both soil and rock, moving through them in ways that shape the landscape. During rainfall, water is absorbed into the ground, where it may remain for a time before emerging as springs or feeding into streams. This movement is slowed by the structure of the soil, preventing rapid runoff and reducing erosion. In areas where the ground becomes saturated, especially after heavy rain, the stability of the soil can change. Slopes may shift slightly, and trees may lose their footing, leading to small changes in the landscape. These events are part of the natural process, contributing to the ongoing shaping of the mountains. The balance between soil, rock, and water is maintained through constant interaction. Each element influences the others, creating a system that supports the forest above. Changes in one part of this system can affect the rest, though these changes often occur gradually. Temperature also plays a role in how these processes unfold. Warmer conditions increase the rate of decomposition, allowing organic material to break down more quickly. Cooler temperatures slow this process, preserving material for longer periods and affecting how nutrients are released into the soil. At higher elevations, where temperatures remain lower, soil development occurs more slowly. This contributes to the differences in vegetation found across the mountains, as plants adapt to the conditions available to them. The forest floor reflects these interactions in its texture and composition. It remains soft and uneven, shaped by layers of material at different stages of decomposition. This surface supports a wide range of organisms, from insects to amphibians, all of which contribute to the ongoing cycle of renewal. The Great Smoky Mountains depend on this foundation to maintain their structure. The visible forest, with its trees and wildlife, rests upon a system that operates largely out of sight, yet is essential to everything that occurs above it. The connection between geology, soil, and life creates a stable environment that continues to evolve over time. The mountains are not static. They change slowly, shaped by processes that have been active for millions of years and continue to influence the landscape today. Within this system, the ground itself is alive with movement and transformation. Nutrients cycle, water flows, and roots grow, all contributing to the balance that defines the Smokies. The land beneath the forest continues its slow transformation. The interaction between plants and this foundation becomes more defined. The Great Smoky Mountains support one of the most diverse collections of plant life in North America, with more than 19,000 documented species and over 100 species of native trees alone. This diversity is not spread evenly, but arranged in layers shaped by elevation, moisture, and light. At lower elevations, broadleaf forests dominate. Oaks, hickories, and tulip poplars rise tall, forming a canopy that spreads wide and captures much of the available sunlight. These trees grow in deeper soils, where nutrients and moisture are more readily available. Their size reflects the stability of these conditions, allowing them to reach heights that define the structure of the forest. Beneath this canopy, a second layer of smaller trees and shrubs develops. Dogwood, redbud, and other understory species grow in the filtered light, adapting to conditions that are less direct but still supportive. Their presence fills the space between the forest floor and the canopy above, creating a continuous vertical structure. The forest floor itself supports a dense layer of plant life, especially during the early part of the year. Wildflowers emerge in large numbers, taking advantage of the sunlight that reaches the ground before the canopy fully forms. This brief period allows for rapid growth, producing one of the most varied displays of flowering plants in the eastern United States. As elevation increases, the composition of the forest begins to change. Cooler temperatures and thinner soils support different species, including maples and birch, that are better adapted to these conditions. The transition is gradual, with overlapping zones where multiple species coexist before one becomes more dominant. Higher still, the shift becomes more pronounced as spruce and fir replace hardwood species. These trees form dense stands, their needle-covered branches creating a darker environment beneath. The ground reflects this change, with moss and low-growing plants replacing the broader leaf cover found at lower elevations. Moisture plays a central role in determining where plants can grow. Areas that retain water for longer periods support a wider range of species, while drier sections limit growth to those adapted to reduced moisture. This variation occurs across short distances, contributing to the overall diversity of the landscape. Light continues to shape these patterns. Open areas allow more direct sunlight, supporting faster growth and a greater variety of plants. In contrast, dense canopy reduces light, favoring species that can survive in shaded conditions. This balance between light and shadow creates a mosaic of environments within the forest. Some sections of the Smokies still contain old-growth forest, where trees have remained undisturbed for hundreds of years. These areas are among the largest remaining old-growth forests in the eastern United States. The structure here is more complex, with multiple layers of vegetation and trees of varying ages growing together. In these older forests, fallen trees remain where they lie, becoming part of the system rather than being removed. As they decompose, they provide nutrients and create new spaces for plant growth. This process adds to the depth of the forest floor and supports a wide range of species. Other areas of the park are younger, shaped by past logging activity that removed large sections of forest. These areas have regrown over time, with trees of more uniform size forming the canopy. As they continue to develop, they gradually move toward the complexity found in older sections. Plant life in the Smokies is also influenced by seasonal change. Growth patterns shift throughout the year, with different species emerging at different times. This timing allows plants to take advantage of specific conditions, such as early spring light, or late summer moisture. In addition to trees and flowering plants, mosses, ferns, and lichens contribute to the diversity of the forest. These organisms thrive in the moist conditions of the Smokies, often covering rocks, logs, and tree trunks. Their presence adds texture to the landscape and supports other forms of life. The interaction between plants and animals further shapes the forest. Seeds are spread by wind, water, and wildlife, allowing plants to expand into new areas. At the same time, animals rely on vegetation for food and shelter, creating a connection that links different parts of the ecosystem. Elevation continues to influence these relationships. As conditions change with height, so does the availability of plant species, which in turn affects the animals that depend on them. This layering of habitats contributes to the overall complexity of the Smokies. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this diversity within a relatively small geographic area. The combination of elevation range, moisture, and stable conditions has allowed plant life to develop in ways that are both varied and interconnected. Each section of the forest reflects the conditions present in that location. From the broadleaf trees of the lower slopes to the dense spruce and fir of the higher ridges, the vegetation forms a continuous system shaped by the land itself. Movement through the forest reveals these changes gradually. A shift in temperature, a difference in light, or a change in soil depth signals the transition from one plant community to another. These transitions are not abrupt, but part of a steady progression across the landscape. The structure of plant life in the Smokies defines how the forest appears and functions. It shapes the canopy, influences the forest floor, and supports the wide range of species that exist within the park. The forest continues to rise and fall across the Great Smoky Mountains. The shape of the land itself becomes more defined through the movement of water and time. The ridges that stretch across the park are not isolated forms, but part of a continuous structure shaped over long periods. Their rounded peaks and extended lines reflect a landscape that has been worn down gradually, rather than formed through sudden change. Erosion remains one of the most consistent forces shaping the Smokies. Rainfall, which averages between 55 and 85 inches each year, moves across the surface and through the soil, slowly wearing down rock and carrying sediment into streams and valleys. These changes are small in any single moment, but they accumulate over long periods, altering the structure of the land. The ridges that define the Smokies are broad and gently sloped, allowing forests to grow continuously across them. Unlike landscapes where exposed rock dominates, the Smokies are almost entirely covered in vegetation. This coverage plays a direct role in stabilizing the soil, reducing the speed of erosion, and maintaining the form of the terrain. Between these ridges, valleys develop where water has moved consistently over time. Some valleys remain narrow, shaped by fast-moving streams that cut deeper into the land. Others widen as water slows and spreads, allowing soil to collect and vegetation to grow more densely. These differences create variation across the landscape while maintaining a connected structure. Elevation continues to influence how these features develop. Higher ridges experience cooler temperatures, increased exposure to wind, and greater moisture from cloud formation. Valleys remain more sheltered, holding warmer air and supporting different patterns of vegetation. These conditions affect how quickly soil forms, how water moves, and how the land continues to change. The composition of the rock beneath the surface also plays a role in shaping the terrain. Some layers break down more easily, contributing to the formation of valleys, while others remain more resistant, supporting the structure of ridges. This variation creates the repeating pattern of elevated ridges separated by lower valleys that extends across the Smokies. Over time, this process produces the layered appearance that defines the mountains. Ridges extend outward in parallel lines, each one shaped by the balance between erosion and resistance within the underlying rock. From a distance, this creates a consistent pattern, though each ridge differs slightly in elevation, slope, and composition. Water continues to guide these changes. Streams follow the natural contours of the land, carving channels that deepen gradually. As they move, they carry sediment from higher elevations to lower areas, redistributing material and contributing to the ongoing formation of valleys. In some areas, erosion exposes sections of rock, revealing the internal structure of the mountains. These outcrops interrupt the forest canopy, offering brief openings where the underlying geology becomes visible. Their presence highlights the connection between the surface of the land and what lies beneath it. The interaction between vegetation and geology remains constant. Roots extend into small fractures in the rock, gradually widening them as they grow. Over time, this contributes to the breakdown of rock into smaller particles, which then become part of the soil. In this way, the forest participates in shaping the terrain, just as the terrain shapes the forest. Gravity influences all of these processes, guiding the movement of material downhill. Soil shifts gradually, especially after periods of heavy rainfall, when the ground becomes saturated. These movements are often subtle, but they contribute to the slow reshaping of slopes and the redistribution of material across the landscape. The Smokies change through steady, continuous processes rather than sudden events. There are no sharp disruptions in the terrain. Instead, the land evolves gradually, shaped by the repeated interaction of water, soil, rock, and vegetation. Light and atmosphere influence how this structure is perceived. Haze settles between ridges, softening their outlines and creating a layered effect that shifts with distance. Each ridge appears slightly different in tone, with those farther away blending into a softer blue-gray. This haze is influenced by both moisture and compounds released by vegetation, interacting with light in ways that define the visual character of the Smokies. It reduces sharp contrast while preserving the overall form of the landscape, allowing the structure of the mountains to remain visible even as details fade with distance. Movement through the Smokies reveals how these geological features connect. A ridge leads into a valley, which rises again into another ridge, forming a continuous pattern that extends across the region. This structure repeats without interruption, creating a landscape that feels unified rather than fragmented. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this form through ongoing change. Water continues to move, soil continues to shift, and vegetation continues to grow and decay, all contributing to the gradual reshaping of the land. The processes remain active at all times, even when their effects are not immediately visible. The result is a landscape defined by persistence, where small, continuous changes shape the mountains over time, maintaining the balance between structure and transformation. The structure of the land continues to shape the forest above it. The Great Smoky Mountains also reveal themselves through the experience of moving across them. The terrain is not uniform, and travel through it follows patterns determined by ridges, valleys, and the natural contours that guide direction. Movement here is never in straight lines. It bends, rises, and descends with the land itself. Paths through the Smokies often follow ridgelines where the ground is more stable and the elevation remains consistent over longer distances. These routes allow for easier travel compared to the steep slopes found elsewhere. From these higher points, the layered structure of the mountains becomes more visible, with ridge after ridge extending outward in long, repeating forms. In contrast, movement through valleys feels more enclosed. The forest grows denser, and the terrain becomes more uneven as water shapes the ground. Streams cut through these areas, creating natural corridors that guide both water and wildlife. These pathways are not always easy to follow, but they reflect the natural flow of the landscape. The park contains more than 800 miles of maintained trails, many of which follow routes that were established long before the park itself existed. Some began as footpaths used by indigenous communities, while others developed later as roads connecting early settlements. Over time, these paths were adapted into the trail system that exists today. Each trail reflects the structure of the land it crosses. Some rise gradually along ridges, allowing for steady movement without sharp changes in elevation. Others climb more directly, following slopes that increase in steepness over shorter distances. The variation in these paths creates different experiences of the same landscape. As elevation changes along these routes, so do the conditions. A trail may begin in a warm, dense forest at lower elevations and gradually move into cooler, more open areas as it rises. This shift can be felt in the air, seen in the vegetation, and heard in the change in sound as wind and water interact differently at each level. The surface of these trails also reflects the terrain. In some areas, the ground is firm and compact, shaped by consistent use and supported by stable soil. In others, roots and rocks create uneven footing, requiring more careful movement. These variations are not random, but shaped by the underlying structure of the mountains. Water continues to influence how these paths develop. Trails often cross streams, following the natural drainage of the land. In wetter areas, sections of trail may remain damp for long periods, while drier ridges offer more stable footing. These differences affect how movement occurs across the park. Visibility changes depending on location. In dense forest, sightlines are limited, and the landscape reveals itself in shorter distances. Movement becomes focused on immediate surroundings, with attention drawn to the ground, nearby trees, and the sounds within the forest. Along open ridges or higher elevations, the view expands. The structure of the Smokies becomes more apparent, with layers of mountains extending into the distance. The presence of haze softens these views, blending ridges together while still allowing their form to be understood. The experience of distance in the Smokies is shaped by both terrain and atmosphere. What appears close may take longer to reach due to elevation changes, while distant ridges may seem nearer because of the way light and haze interact. This creates a sense of depth that shifts depending on position and time of day. Movement through the mountains also reveals how connected each part of the landscape is. A trail that begins near a stream may rise into hardwood forest, continue into cooler elevations, and eventually reach areas dominated by spruce and fir. This progression occurs within a single route, reflecting the broader structure of the park. Wildlife follows many of these same patterns. Animals move along ridges where travel is more efficient, or follow waterways where resources are concentrated. Their paths are not marked in the same way as human trails, but they reflect the same underlying logic shaped by the land. The passage of time is also visible along these routes. Sections of trail may show signs of erosion where water has moved across them, while others remain stable due to the structure of the soil and vegetation. Maintenance helps preserve these paths, but the influence of natural processes is always present. Sound becomes an important part of movement through the Smokies. In enclosed areas, sounds are softened by the density of the forest. In more open sections, they travel farther, carrying across ridges and valleys. The steady presence of water, wind, and wildlife creates a background that changes with location. The physical effort of moving through this terrain reflects the structure of the mountains. Climbing requires steady adjustment to elevation, while descending follows the natural pull of gravity. These changes are gradual, but they shape how distance is experienced across the landscape. The Great Smoky Mountains do not reveal themselves all at once. They are understood through movement, through the gradual transition from one elevation to another, and through the shifting conditions that define each section of the park. Each path through the Smokies offers a different view of the same system. The land guides direction, the forest shapes visibility, and the atmosphere influences how distance is perceived. Together, these elements create an experience that is defined by progression rather than a single fixed perspective. The landscape continues to shift with elevation, moisture, and movement. The Great Smoky Mountains also reveal their scale through the way distance is measured across them. Unlike flat terrain, where distance can be understood in straight lines, the Smokies stretch distance through elevation, curvature, and the constant rise and fall of the land. A single mile within the mountains rarely feels like a straight path. Trails climb, descend, and bend around ridges, extending the effort required to move from one point to another. This creates a sense of distance that is shaped more by terrain than by measurement, where time and effort become more noticeable than the actual length traveled. The park covers more than 500,000 acres, spanning the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. Within this area, the variation in elevation creates a range of environments that would normally be spread across much larger regions. This concentration allows the Smokies to hold an unusual level of diversity within a relatively compact space. Ridges extend outward in repeating lines, often running parallel to one another. From certain viewpoints, these ridges appear to stretch endlessly, fading into layers of haze that soften their outlines. This effect is not only visual, but also spatial, making it difficult to judge how far one ridge is from the next. Valleys between these ridges create natural divisions within the landscape. Movement from one valley to another often requires crossing a ridge, adding elevation change to horizontal distance. This structure gives the mountains their depth, where each section feels distinct while remaining connected to the whole. The Appalachian Trail passes through the Smoky Mountains, following the highest ridges for approximately 70 miles. Along this route, elevation remains relatively high, offering extended views of the surrounding landscape. The trail reflects the natural contours of the mountains, rising and falling with the terrain rather than cutting directly across it. Distance along these ridges can feel both extended and compressed. On clear days, visibility may reach for miles, allowing distant peaks to be seen clearly. On other days, haze or fog may limit sight to a much shorter range, reducing the perceived scale of the landscape. This variation in visibility changes how distance is experienced. A ridge that appears close may take hours to reach due to elevation changes, while distant layers may seem within reach but remain far beyond immediate travel. The interaction between terrain and atmosphere creates a shifting sense of space. The structure of the Smokies also affects how sound travels across distance. In open areas, sound can carry from one ridge to another, while dense forest absorbs and softens it. Streams, wind, and wildlife create patterns of sound that change depending on location, contributing to the overall perception of space. Waterways provide another measure of distance. Streams begin as small flows at higher elevations and gather strength as they move downward, eventually joining larger river systems. Following a stream reveals how water connects different parts of the mountains, linking ridges and valleys through a continuous path. The scale of the Smokies is also reflected in the time it takes for natural processes to shape the land. Erosion, soil formation, and forest growth occur slowly, often beyond immediate observation. These processes define the mountains over long periods, creating a landscape that changes gradually rather than abruptly. Movement through the park reveals how these elements interact. A path may begin in a valley, rise along a ridge, and descend again into another basin, each section presenting a different environment. This progression creates a sense of scale that is built through experience rather than measurement alone. The forest contributes to this perception by limiting visibility in some areas and opening it in others. Dense vegetation creates enclosed spaces where distance feels shorter, while open ridges allow for extended views that emphasize the breadth of the landscape. Elevation continues to shape these experiences. Higher points provide a wider view of the surrounding mountains, while lower areas focus attention on immediate surroundings. This contrast allows the Smokies to feel both expansive and contained at the same time. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this balance between distance and structure, where space is defined by the interaction of land, air, and vegetation. Each ridge, valley, and slope contributes to a system that extends across the park, creating a landscape that is understood through movement and observation. As conditions shift throughout the day, so does the perception of distance. Light, haze, and weather alter how far the eye can see and how clearly the landscape is defined. These changes add to the sense of variation within the mountains, where no single view represents the entire space. The Smokies do not present their full scale at once. They reveal it gradually, through the layering of ridges, the rise and fall of terrain, and the shifting conditions that define how the landscape is seen and experienced. The structure of distance continues to unfold across the Great Smoky Mountains. The presence of light begins to shape how the landscape is experienced from one moment to the next. Light does not fall evenly across the mountains. It moves with the terrain, guided by ridges, valleys, and the shifting position of the sun throughout the day. In the early part of the day, light reaches the higher ridges first, leaving valleys in shadow for longer periods. This creates a layered contrast where upper elevations appear brighter while lower sections remain subdued. The sun rises, this balance shifts, and light begins to move downward across the slopes, gradually filling in the darker areas. By midday, light becomes more direct, reducing shadows and revealing more detail across the landscape. The forest canopy reflects this light differently, depending on the type of trees present. Broadleaf forests appear brighter, their leaves catching and scattering sunlight, while evergreen sections absorb more light, maintaining deeper tones within the forest. This interaction between light and vegetation creates variation across short distances. One section of forest may appear open and illuminated, while another remains shaded and enclosed. These differences are shaped by the density of the canopy and the angle at which light reaches the ground. The day progresses, the angle of light begins to change again. Shadows lengthen along the slopes, emphasizing the contours of the land. Ridges become more defined as light strikes them from the side, revealing their shape more clearly than during the middle of the day. The presence of haze influences how light moves across the Smokies. Moisture in the air scatters sunlight, softening its intensity and blending distant ridges together. This effect reduces sharp contrasts and creates the layered appearance that defines the mountains. In areas where haze is thicker, light becomes diffused, spreading evenly across the landscape rather than creating strong highlights and shadows. This gives the forest a more uniform tone, where details are softened and distance becomes harder to judge. Cloud cover adds another layer to this interaction. When clouds pass over the mountains, they filter the sunlight, reducing brightness and altering how colors appear. The forest may shift from vibrant to muted within a short period, depending on how light is blocked or allowed through. At times, breaks in the clouds allow beams of light to pass through, illuminating specific sections of the landscape while leaving others in shadow. These moments are brief, but they highlight the uneven distribution of light across the terrain. The sun lowers, light becomes warmer in tone, changing the appearance of the forest. Leaves and tree trunks take on deeper colors, and the contrast between light and shadow increases. This shift emphasizes the texture of the landscape, making the structure of ridges and valleys more visible. Higher elevations hold onto light longer than valleys, which begin to darken earlier. This creates another layered effect, where upper ridges remain illuminated while lower areas move into shadow. The difference reflects the same elevation-based patterns seen throughout the day. Light also affects how movement is perceived. In brighter conditions, details are easier to see, and motion stands out more clearly. As light fades, movement becomes more subtle, defined more by sound than by sight. Water reflects these changes in light as well. Streams that appear bright and reflective under direct sunlight become darker as light angles shift. Reflections break into smaller patterns, moving with the current and changing as the surrounding light changes. The forest floor responds to light in similar ways. In areas where sunlight reaches through the canopy, the ground becomes more defined, revealing textures of leaves, roots, and soil. In shaded areas, these details remain subdued, blending into the overall tone of the forest. The interaction between light and the Smoky Mountains is continuous. It changes from moment to moment, shaped by the position of the sun, the presence of haze, and the structure of the land itself. No single condition remains for long, and each shift reveals a different aspect of the landscape. The day approaches its later hours. The balance between light and shadow becomes more pronounced. The forest no longer appears evenly lit, but divided into areas of brightness and darkness that move slowly across the terrain. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this movement of light as part of their overall rhythm. Just as water flows and air shifts, light travels across the land, revealing and concealing different elements as it moves. The structure of the mountains remains constant, but the way it is seen continues to change. Ridges appear and fade, valleys deepen in shadow, and the forest shifts in tone, all guided by the steady movement of light across the landscape. As light continues to shift across the Great Smoky Mountains, the presence of sound begins to define the landscape in a more constant way. Unlike light, which changes with time and position, sound remains continuous, shaped by the structure of the land and the movement of air, water, and life within the forest. The most consistent sound in the Smokies comes from water. With more than 2,000 miles of streams flowing through the park, the movement of water creates a steady background that changes depending on location. In steeper areas, water moves quickly over rock, producing a sharper, more continuous sound. In flatter sections, it slows, creating softer, more rhythmic patterns. This variation in sound reflects the terrain itself. Narrow valleys concentrate the movement of water, making it louder and more defined, while broader areas allow it to spread out and soften. The structure of the land shapes not only how water flows, but how it is heard. Wind adds another layer to this soundscape. Along exposed ridges, air moves more freely, passing through branches and creating a steady, shifting noise that rises and falls with its strength. In sheltered valleys, wind is less noticeable, and the forest absorbs much of its movement, allowing other sounds to become more prominent. Leaves respond to even slight changes in air movement. A small shift in wind can pass through the canopy, creating a ripple effect that moves from one tree to another. This movement produces a soft, continuous sound that blends with the surrounding environment. Wildlife contributes to this system in more intermittent ways. Bird calls carry through the forest, sometimes traveling long distances, depending on the density of the vegetation and the position of the terrain. More than 200 species of birds exist within the Smokies, each adding to the variety of sounds that appear throughout the day. Insects form another layer of sound, especially in warmer months. Their presence is often constant, creating a background tone that fills the spaces between other noises. This sound is not uniform. It changes in intensity and pattern depending on temperature, moisture, and time of day. At certain times of year, the forest includes more distinct patterns of sound. Synchronous fireflies, known primarily for their coordinated light, also contribute to subtle movement within the environment. Though quiet themselves, their presence reflects the precise timing of natural systems that operate throughout the park. Sound behaves differently depending on the structure of the forest. Dense vegetation absorbs and softens noise, limiting how far it travels. In more open areas, sound can move more freely, carrying across ridges and valleys and connecting different parts of the landscape. Elevation influences this as well. Higher areas, with less dense vegetation and more exposure, allow sound to travel farther. Lower areas, with thicker forest cover, create a more contained environment where sounds remain closer and more subdued. Moisture in the air can also affect how sound moves. On humid days, sound may carry more clearly, while in drier conditions, it may seem more distant. Fog can soften sound further, reducing its clarity and blending it into the surrounding environment. The interaction between these elements creates a soundscape that is constantly shifting, even when it appears steady. No single sound dominates the Smokies. Instead, multiple layers combine to form a continuous background that reflects the movement of the environment. Movement through the forest reveals how sound changes with location. A path near a stream will carry the steady noise of water, while a ridge may be defined more by wind and distant bird calls. Each area has its own balance, shaped by the features that surround it. The absence of sound can be just as noticeable as its presence. In certain moments, when wind slows and wildlife remains still, the forest holds a quieter tone that emphasizes the subtle movements that continue beneath it. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this system of sound as part of their overall structure. Just as water shapes the land and light defines visibility, sound reveals the movement that continues within the forest at all times. Each element contributes to this environment without overwhelming the others. Water, wind, wildlife, and vegetation interact to create a balanced system that reflects the conditions of the land. The landscape is not silent. It is defined by the continuous presence of sound, shaped by the same factors that influence every other part of the Smokies. The movement of sound continues across the Great Smoky Mountains. The presence of time begins to reveal itself through patterns that extend beyond a single day or season. These patterns are not always visible in the moment, but they shape the structure of the forest, the behavior of wildlife, and the gradual transformation of the landscape over years and decades. The forest that exists today reflects a long period of recovery and growth. Large sections of the Smokies were logged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, removing vast areas of mature trees. When the national park was established in 1934, these areas were left to regrow, allowing the forest to return through natural processes rather than controlled planting. This regrowth did not happen evenly. Some areas recovered more quickly, supported by deeper soil and stable moisture, while others developed more slowly, where conditions were less favorable. Over time, these differences created a variation in forest age across the park, with younger stands existing alongside sections of old growth that were never logged. Old-growth forests in the Smokies are among the largest remaining in the eastern United States. These areas contain trees that have grown for hundreds of years, forming complex structures with multiple layers of vegetation. The canopy is uneven, with gaps where older trees have fallen and new growth has taken hold. In contrast, younger forests tend to have trees of more uniform size and spacing. Their canopy is more consistent, with fewer gaps and less variation in structure. As these forests continue to age, they gradually develop the complexity found in older sections, adding to the diversity of the landscape. The passage of time is also visible in the soil. Layers of organic material build slowly as leaves and fallen wood decompose. This process adds depth to the forest floor, increasing its ability to retain moisture and support plant growth. Over decades, this accumulation contributes to the stability of the entire system. Wildlife patterns reflect these long-term changes as well. As forests grow and shift, the availability of food and shelter changes, influencing where species are found and how they move across the landscape. Some species thrive in younger forests, while others depend on the structure of older growth. Human influence, though reduced, continues to shape certain aspects of the Smokies. Air quality, for example, affects high-elevation forests more strongly than lower areas. Pollutants carried through the atmosphere can alter soil chemistry and impact plant health over time, particularly in sensitive environments like spruce and fir stands. Efforts to manage and protect the park focus on maintaining its long-term stability. This includes monitoring wildlife populations, restoring damaged areas, and limiting human impact on the landscape. The goal is not to control every change, but to allow natural processes to continue while reducing external pressures. Climate patterns also influence how the Smokies change over time. Variations in temperature and precipitation affect growing seasons, water availability, and the distribution of species. These changes occur gradually, but their effects become more noticeable over longer periods. The interaction between stability and change defines the character of the Smokies. While the mountains themselves appear constant, the systems within them are always adjusting. Forests grow, decay, and regrow. Water continues to shape the land. Wildlife adapts to shifting conditions. These processes do not follow a fixed timeline. They overlap and interact, creating a continuous flow rather than a series of separate stages. The forest that exists at any moment is the result of countless changes that have occurred over time. Movement through the Smokies reveals these layers gradually. A section of older forest may stand beside an area of younger growth, each reflecting a different period in the park's history. Subtle differences in tree size, spacing, and ground cover indicate how these areas have developed. The Great Smoky Mountains hold this sense of time within their landscape. Past and present exist together, with each layer contributing to the overall structure of the forest. Change is constant, but it occurs at a pace that often feels steady and controlled. This balance allows the Smokies to remain both stable and dynamic. The mountains do not remain unchanged, but they do not shift suddenly. Instead, they evolve through processes that unfold over extended periods, shaping the environment in ways that are both visible and subtle. The landscape settles into its steady rhythm. The Great Smoky Mountains hold together everything that has moved through them. The ridges, valleys, forests, and waterways do not exist as separate elements, but as parts of a single system shaped by elevation, moisture, and time. Each layer connects to the next, forming a structure that remains continuous across the entire range. The forest continues to grow and adjust, shaped by the conditions of the land beneath it. Trees rise, fall, and return to the soil, creating a cycle that supports the next generation of growth. The canopy shifts gradually, opening and closing in response to change, while the forest floor holds the material that sustains this process. Water moves through the mountains without pause, beginning as moisture in the air, settling into the ground. and emerging again as streams that flow through valleys and into larger river systems. This movement shapes the land, supports plant life, and provides the conditions needed for the wide range of species that exist within the park. Wildlife continues to move through this system, guided by the availability of food, shelter, and suitable conditions. Each species follows patterns shaped by elevation, season, and the structure of the forest, contributing to a network of activity that remains constant even when it is not immediately visible. The atmosphere above the Smokies interacts with the land below, carrying moisture, forming clouds, and creating the haze that defines the mountains. Light moves across the ridges, revealing and softening their structure, while sound travels through the forest, reflecting the movement of water, wind, and life. These elements do not act independently. They are connected through processes that repeat and adjust over time. Changes in one part of the system influence others, creating a balance that allows the Smokies to function as a whole. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park remains one of the most visited national parks in the United States, drawing millions of people each year. Despite this level of attention, the landscape continues to operate according to the same natural patterns that have shaped it over long periods. The structure of the land, the movement of water, and the growth of the forest remain consistent. Protection of the park has allowed these processes to continue with limited interruption. Large sections of forest have been left to recover from past use, and ongoing efforts focus on preserving the conditions that support this environment. The result is a landscape that reflects both its history and its continued development. Movement through the Smokies reveals how these systems connect. A path may follow a ridge, descend into a valley, cross a stream, and rise again into a different forest type, all within a relatively short distance. Each transition reflects a change in elevation, moisture, or soil, showing how closely these factors are linked. The sense of distance across the mountains is shaped by these changes. Ridges extend outward in layers, softened by haze, while valleys create depth and variation. The landscape does not present itself all at once, but through a sequence of connected elements that unfold over time. The forest, water, wildlife, and atmosphere continue to interact without pause. Each element supports the others, creating a system that remains active and balanced. The Smokies are defined by this interaction, where no single feature stands alone. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Great Smoky Mountains.